Hollywood once turned Rock Hudson, Charles Lawton, and Anthony Perkins into the very standard of masculinity. But behind those images that the public adored were secrets they were never allowed to name. The price of that silence was not borne by them alone. Beside them stood the women who had loved sincerely, who had given their youth and their trust, only to realize too late that their marriage was nothing more than a public facade. That was the moment Judy Garland stood frozen outside the bedroom door. It was the long years Elsa Lanchester spent brewing tea, smiling, and joining her husband in protecting a truth that could never be spoken. It was the belated pain of Amanda Blake, when the secret appeared together with the century's most feared disease. Today, we will step through Hollywood's velvet curtain to reopen the files on 10 marriages in which love, fame, and deception walked side by side. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring the dark corners behind the spotlight. Phyllis Gates and Rock Hudson, The Cruel Play, scripted by a serial charmer. When people spoke of Rock Hudson in the 1950s, the public almost instantly pictured the complete measure of masculinity: a powerful physique, a handsome face, a radiant smile paired with an irresistible, rakish charm. The actor was the idol who set millions of women's hearts racing across the planet. Then came Phyllis Gates, the elegant secretary who became the woman who won when she slipped into a wedding gown and stood beside the male god of every American girl's dreams. Phyllis stepped into married life filled with pride, placing absolute faith in her husband's masculine prowess and certain that she was the final destination of that glamorous playboy. Yet that perfect performance existed only under the flashbulbs of the press. The moment the door closed and the cameras stopped rolling, the glittering shell covering that marriage began to show its first cracks. The honeymoon ended in a rush, before Phyllis had even managed to store away every bit of her joy. And then everything quietly shifted. Rock started making excuses about exhaustion, was constantly away from home. The explanations sounded persuasive at first, but were repeated so often that they became hollow. Physical contact grew sparse. His gaze no longer lingered on her figure, and the longing of earlier days vanished without a trace, replaced by an icy distance that was hard to explain. Night after night, Phyllis lay awake craving a simple warmth of intimacy. Yet the only thing she received was that broad back turned toward her, like an invisible barrier blocking every feeling. She refused to give up. Phyllis actively changed herself, worked to refresh her appearance, cultivated a softer, more seductive allure, and forced herself to ignore the persistent rumors circulating through the entertainment world. She comforted herself that everything was merely a temporary storm, a difficulty every family experiences, and clung to that thin ray of hope like a final lifeline. But the truth is never something that can be hidden forever. It began to reveal itself in the smallest traces: late-night phone calls carrying unfamiliar male voices, carefully hidden letters full of implication, and Rock's frequent visits to underground clubs known to be private spaces for the gay community. The scattered pieces gradually fitted together until the complete picture left no room for denial or self-deception. Phyllis did not wait for a confession. Everything was already crystal clear. The confrontation erupted like a long-suppressed storm. Tears, choking sobs, and accumulated fury poured out with every question. "What do you take me for?" a screen to hide behind. The bitter accusation was not simply anger. It marked the moment the woman understood that the entire marriage she had lived was a carefully arranged script. And in that very second, her last shred of self-respect shattered. Phyllis awoke to the bitter reality. She had never played the role of a real wife. She had only been the perfect tool in a publicity script crafted by the studio and by the very man in whom she had placed complete trust. Divorce became inevitable, leaving behind a throbbing wound in Phyllis's soul that lasted for decades. As for Rock Hudson, he carried that secret with him until the final days of his life. Judy Garland and Vincente Minnelli, The Knife Behind the Velvet Curtain. In the same era, The romance between Judy Garland and Vincente Minnelli was praised by Hollywood as a perfect symbol. In the public eye, they were the golden couple, the dazzling female star united with the brilliant director. Everyone believed that after countless upheavals, the precious gem of America had finally found a man understanding and generous enough to protect her. Yet, when the stage lights dimmed and the applause faded into the air, Judy returned with the simplest desire in her heart, to be loved sincerely. She entered that marriage with the passionate soul of an artist, hoping to touch completeness, where two individuals would not only share artistic harmony, but also intertwine in passionate physical longing. To Judy, Vincente was not merely a husband. He represented a peaceful harbor in which to shelter after the fierce storms of glory. Reality, however, was colder than any script ever written. Through long nights, Judy waited in quiet hope. She yearned for a genuine connection, a tight embrace filled with the breath of love. What did she receive instead? Kindness, yet cold to a frightening degree. Vincente still paid attention, still cared for her. Yet it was only the respect a guardian bestows upon a flower, never the desiring gaze of a man for the woman he loves. In that spacious bedroom, the warmth seemed to evaporate little by little. Judy curled into silence while tears fell as she began to doubt herself. Am I too plain? Or has fame made him weary of me? Those sharp questions cut into her mind like knives, carving at a soul already fragile and pushing her closer to the edge of depression. Then the worst moment arrived without warning. One evening, finishing work earlier than expected, Judy came home in a joyful mood, intending to surprise her husband. She turned the key gently in the lock, the door slowly opened, and in that exact instant, she stood stunned. The scene before her was like a razor-sharp blade slicing through every beautiful dream she had treasured, right in the middle of their shared home, on their very own bed. Vincente was reclining, lost in the arms of a strange man. My soul shattered the moment that door opened. Judy once confessed, choking back tears. There were no screams that tore the air, no furious scene of smashing and shouting. Judy simply stood frozen on the threshold, utterly alone. The wound was so deep it extinguished completely her faith in the idea of true love. That married life continued for a while longer, like a silent play. They still showed each other the necessary respect in public and jointly raised their little daughter, Liza Minnelli. Yet deep inside, every hope had quietly died. The moment that night's door closed, Judy bitterly realized the harsh truth. She had never been the love of his life. She was merely a glittering shell. The perfect piece used to cover the picture of the model home that Vincente wished to display to the world. A Hollywood monument had fallen because of deception, and somewhere, while the spotlight continued to enchant young hearts, a similar script was quietly beginning again, the moment another woman also sought love with all her hope, only to receive an ending no less cruel. Carol Channing and Charles Lowe, 42 years playing the perfect role on an empty stage. Carol Channing was the brilliant star of Broadway, the woman who could light up an entire auditorium with a single smile. Beside her, Charles Lowe always appeared with a calm demeanor and devoted loyalty, representing the model husband who quietly stood behind all the glory, the man everyone assumed had poured his heart into supporting his wife. Yet the true nature of that marriage had never existed on the stage. Charles had never truly belonged to the world in which he appeared. In his eyes, this home was like a well-fitting coat that helped him pass through the harsh prejudices of the era, when living according to one's true nature could cost both reputation and career. He needed Carol, not only for affection, but because her status was enough to keep him safe under society's gaze. As for Carol, she had no idea of any of this at the beginning. The truth did not arrive like a violent shock. It quietly seeped in through small traces. Charles's absences from home in the afternoons grew more frequent, without explanation, without any clear clue, he would leave their shared home and slip into the city's dark corners, where gay bars allowed him to live truly with his own nature and temporarily cast off the shell of the star's husband that he had to wear every day. On the other side, Carol gradually sensed the emptiness that no words could fill. She did not question. She did not force anything. She did not try to smash what existed, because she understood that certain secrets, once brought into the light, would pull everything down. And in the sacred ground of Broadway, where image was polished more carefully than emotion, silence sometimes became the only way to maintain stability. So she stayed. That married life stretched on like a performance lasting 42 years. Charles managed everything behind the scenes while Carol stepped onto the stage on time, in perfect character, with a smile that never faded. They stood side by side long enough for the world to believe it was love, even though real intimacy had never appeared between them, right up until the day Charles died. Yet not every home chooses the path of patient endurance. In another story, two people entered marriage with understanding from the very start, and turned it into a strange agreement linking light and darkness. Angela Lansbury and Richard Cromwell. The farewell note on the vanity table. At the age of 19, Angela Lansbury possessed a radiant, pure beauty and abundant vitality. When she agreed to marry Richard Cromwell, a captivating star 15 years older, rich in experience and worldly charm, Angela had already woven countless beautiful scenarios in her mind. To the young girl, Richard was the ideal guide who would open the door to a mature world of love, where she could freely feel intense heartbeats and immerse herself in sacred connection. The first days of that home passed with a gentle sweetness. Just turning 20, Angela actively lit the candles of romance, waiting for whispered words of intimacy and longing for the warmth of the man she adored. Yet, whenever the flame of passion began to flicker, Richard skillfully extinguished it with a cold politeness that was merciless. Behind the image of the perfect gentleman on screen, Richard built a wall of ice right inside the bedroom. Every petty excuse, every cold turning of his back left Angela reeling in a terrifying silence. Years later, she recalled bitterly, he always complained that he was very tired or that the burden of work was too heavy, then turned his back and left me alone with utter confusion. Those words cut straight into the young woman's self-esteem. Night after night, Angela stood before the mirror, quietly gazing at herself and choking back the question, am I too plain, or do I no longer have any attraction left? Seeds of inferiority quietly took root, gradually strangling the innocence and radiance she had always possessed. That marriage, which lasted less than a year, did not end in a violent storm but closed in a cold emptiness that sent chills down the spine. One afternoon, Angela came home and immediately felt a strange silence covering the house. Closet doors stood half open and empty. Every trace of Richard had vanished as if he had never been there. On the vanity table, a small piece of paper lay quietly, both a farewell and the final knife. Without hesitation, Richard openly stated the truth about himself in cold lines. He admitted he could no longer continue the role of the proper husband and had to leave in order to find his true self again. Angela stood stunned in the room, the letter trembling in her hands. It turned out that throughout all those days, she had never been inferior to any other woman. She had simply been facing a world she could never enter. Tears seemed unable to fall. Only a vast emptiness remained as she realized she had merely been an unwilling spectator in the play of his life. Yet when the storm passed, what remained was not anger. Angela, with rare generosity, chose to understand the tragedy of a person forced to live behind a mask for so long. They parted as a husband and wife, but tightened a bond of true friendship. Until Richard's final days, Angela was still there, preserving complete respect for the man who had once hurt her while helping her understand how cruel it is when one cannot live according to one's true nature. Janet Gaynor and Adrian, the magnificent gowns and the loneliness of a doll in a glass case. Janet Gaynor, the Academy's darling, the woman whose smile and pure face made anyone want to protect her. When she married Adrian, the most powerful costume designer in Hollywood, the entire world almost unanimously recognized them as a perfect couple. Adrian was praised as a fashion wizard, the man capable of turning any woman into a goddess with soft lengths of silk. Yet the paradox was that his soul never turned toward them. Behind the scenes, Adrian was a gay man, long familiar to the show business world. Nevertheless, before the public eye, he needed Janet as a perfect shell to protect the position and empire he had painstakingly built. Inside their home, every detail radiated a meticulousness that bordered on coldness. Adrian cared for Janet like a valuable object kept in a glass case, dressing her in the most luxurious gowns and escorting her to the most splendid Hollywood parties. But when the lights dimmed and all the glory retreated, leaving only two individuals in private space, that distance became truly clear. In the bedroom, fragrant with flowers, Adrian turned into a block of ice no one could touch. He never looked at Janet with the desiring gaze of a man for the woman he possessed. To him, Janet was simply a work of art to be admired, while the young men outside were the ones who stirred every deepest emotion. Janet did not discover it at once, yet the small clues gradually connected into a picture that could not be denied. Expensive gifts sent in silence. Afternoons when Adrian disappeared without explanation. Places whose true nature everyone already knew. She gradually realized, yet still chose silence. Outwardly, Janet continued to appear elegant in the clothes her husband himself had designed, still smiling as if she lived in a perfect home. Behind it, however, she carried a persistent loneliness that stretched through the years. The truth was that she had never played the role of his woman. She was merely a meticulously constructed screen so that Adrian could exist without being criticized. The marriage lasted until death, yet left behind an emptiness that could never be filled, where closeness had never appeared, where the soul had never once been truly warmed, even though it was surrounded by the world's most luxurious silks and velvets. A perfect exterior is entirely capable of making people believe in a beautiful script. Yet the moment one key piece is missing, everything becomes a fragile structure. And in the next story, that missing piece was not merely absent, it had never existed from the very beginning. Elsa Lanchester and Charles Lawton, the pact between the monster and the muse. In the glamorous capital of Hollywood in the 1930s, Charles Lawton appeared as a lonely giant, with a rugged exterior yet hiding the soul of an artist overflowing with poetry. When Elsa Lanchester agreed to join her life with his, she was not simply falling for a man, she also cherished the depth of his intellect and the vast world of his imagination. Yet the sweet period had not even been completed when it was abruptly extinguished by a shocking incident. Charles was detained by the authorities while secretly being intimate with a young man in a park. Facing his young wife, who was reeling in shock, Charles did not choose to conceal. He fell to his knees, tears streaming, and confessed the entire truth about his sexual orientation amid the deepest shame and despair. Standing at that turning point, instead of turning away and abandoning him, Elsa made a decision that completely overturned fate. She agreed to establish an open relationship. A silent agreement was formed in the darkness of the magnificent villa. Charles longed for a screen to shield his peak career, while Elsa, she cherished that kindred spirit so much that she resigned herself to sacrificing the ordinary role of a wife. The long nights that followed became an endless spiritual torture. Night after night, Elsa waited wearily for a gesture of affection. Yet the only thing she received was the cold sound of the door closing at dawn when Charles returned from his prolonged pleasures outside. She watched with her own eyes as her husband immersed himself with young men, witnessed the radiance on his face when he spoke of his same-sex relationships. Elsa chose to turn away quietly, gently brewing a warm cup of tea to welcome him home with the wounds of fleeting affairs still on his soul. She was not merely a spouse, she gradually became the most loyal accomplice, covering for an orientation that the standards of that era labeled a crime. A 33-year marriage without any true sexual intimacy remained, filled only with endurance, saturated with a cruel understanding. The pain never disappeared. It was shared and then transformed into a strange kind of affection that only those inside could comprehend. They chose to hold hands tightly and walk through the darkness of the truth. Nevertheless, not every story begins with mutual understanding like that. In another shadowed corner of Hollywood, the deceptions were woven more finely, more darkly, hidden behind the stitches of a king of design, where a woman stepped into love without ever knowing she was a character in a luxurious script. Barry Berenson and Anthony Perkins, the missing piece in the perfect shell. The romance between Barry Berenson and Anthony Perkins began like a late, gentle love song that carried a prolonged low note. Barry, a talented photographer and actress full of character, had spent her entire youth secretly loving Anthony's fragile, melancholic beauty. When the two officially became a couple, she was certain she had finally touched the shore of the happiness she had long desired. They talked for days on end, passionately discussing art, beauty, and the values that only sensitive souls can understand. Yet that harmony existed in only half the world. The remaining piece was cold beyond any possibility of touch. Outwardly, they appeared as a perfect couple. Barry's smile always shone before the camera, while Anthony maintained his familiar, attractive quietness. Behind that curtain, however, were long, silent nights in which the distance between the two individuals existed right inside the room they shared. Anthony was immersed in another world where there was no space left for Barry. Then reality gradually cracked, not with noise, only quietly, the way a fracture spreads across glass. One day she touched it. Several private photographs, handwritten letters overflowing with sweetness, deep emotions, yet none of them intended for her. Anthony had given all of that to other men. There was no explosive scene, no heart-rending cries, only a thick atmosphere at the moment everything collapsed in silence. Barry understood, and in that very second she fell into a choice with no way back. To walk away, or to accept staying with a love that was incomplete. She chose to stay, not because she was blind to the truth, but because she could not cut away the affection that had sunk so deeply into her heart for so long. She accepted the unfinished reality, comforting herself that as long as she could remain beside him, as long as she could maintain that fragile thread of connection, that was already enough. Their marriage continued to exist in its own way, not noisy, not broken, yet never complete either. Two people walked side by side, carrying things that could never be spoken aloud, until everything ended according to a script no one had foreseen. Anthony breathed his last because of the century's disease. Barry was still there, holding his hand tightly in the final moments, completing fully the duty of a wife. Yet when everything closed, what remained was not peace. It was a vast emptiness, because she had poured out her entire heart to love, but had never received reciprocity in the way her heart had always longed for. Charlotte Ray and John Strauss. 25 years of deception and the belated truth. For Charlotte Ray, married life beside the musician John Strauss had once been like a gentle melody that resonated for 25 years. They welcomed children, possessed solid careers, and formed a model family that everyone who looked upon it admired. Charlotte believed in that peace with all the sincerity of a wife. She never once felt the slightest suspicion. Even when John gradually grew distant in the evenings, or when the inspiration-seeking trips stretched unusually long, she looked back at herself, quietly blaming the thought that perhaps time had faded her attractiveness, without ever realizing that the man beside her was living an entirely different life. The truth did not crash down like a violent shock. It arrived on an ordinary day, quietly, the way everything had unfolded for decades. After the long stretch of concealment, John no longer had the strength to keep the cracking mask in place. He sat down opposite Charlotte and for the first time confessed what he had hidden for nearly a lifetime. "I cannot continue living like this any longer." His voice was slow, heavy, as if each word had to be pulled up from the depths. "I am gay, and I have been this way since before we married. All these years, I have tried to become the person you needed, yet I cannot." The truth stood there, clear, cold, leaving no room for any evasion. Charlotte went silent, not because she failed to understand, but because everything she had ever believed suddenly dissolved in the quiet. Later, looking back, she uttered only one simple yet heavy sentence. "I felt as if I had been living with a ghost." It was not merely an act of betrayal by a husband. It represented the feeling that an entire youth had been stripped of meaning, when the things that seemed real had only been a role maintained to deceive the world. Yet what surprised the public lay in Charlotte's decision afterward. At an age when many people try to cling to the cracked pieces, she neither blamed nor sank into anger. She chose divorce, not for revenge, but to free herself. Because in the end, Charlotte understood a simple yet poignant truth. Forgiveness is not something one grants to the person who caused the wound. It is the path that frees oneself from the chains of the past. And for the first time after countless years, she walked away from that marriage, not as the abandoned one, but as a person who had just found herself again. Amanda Blake and Mark Spaeth, The Kiss of Death and the Secret Beneath the Grave. When the glory from the series Gunsmoke gradually faded, Amanda Blake no longer sought frivolous values. Her desire at that time was extremely simple, a shoulder warm enough to lean on in the years of late afternoon. And then she formed a bond with Mark Spaeth. He appeared like a proper gentleman, bringing the feeling of being protected and loved after a long period of loneliness amid Hollywood. They came together amid the blessings of friends, a brief marriage yet enough to kindle hope for a peaceful old age. Yet everything collapsed faster than anyone could imagine. Only 1 year after the wedding, Mark suddenly breathed his last. While Amanda was still submerged in the pain of loss, another reality quietly emerged from the medical records, a truth that was icy and irreversible. Mark was not only a gay man who had lived in the shadows, he also carried the century's disease, AIDS, which he had completely concealed throughout the time they lived together. In that moment, Amanda awoke. The man to whom she had given complete trust had delivered to her a kiss of death in the most literal sense. Mark's departure did not close the incident. It only began another tragedy. Amanda had to face increasingly severe health complications and eventually also passed away from the illness related to the very virus her late husband had transmitted. Behind the image of the proper gentleman lay a cold, ruthless selfishness. Mark had placed the life of the woman who loved him on the gambling table solely to preserve a safe shell under the public gaze. Amanda died in silence, carrying a choking resentment that could never be spoken, a late love, yet one wrapped in lethal deceptions. She had paid too high a price for her trust. Yet there remained another woman, one who chose to smile before the world, even when inside there was only an emptiness that could never be filled, lasting until the final breath. Princess Margaret and Anthony Armstrong Jones, the Gilded Royal Cage and the Sleepless Nights, in the history of the British royal family. Princess Margaret has always been recorded as the rebellious Rose, the woman who carried in her heart a fierce longing for passion and freedom. When she married Anthony Armstrong Jones, a talented and strong-willed photographer, the entire world once believed this was the marriage that shattered every mold, a modern, bold, and radiant love story. Yet, behind that magnificent exterior lay a completely opposite reality. Anthony was a free-spirited artist, and he never belonged exclusively to any woman. He did not even entirely belong to that space. While Margaret wearily waited for genuine connection, an embrace warm enough to drive away the loneliness of royal life, Antony frequently vanished into another world, where men, male models, and secret pleasures that were never named existed. Arguments gradually became familiar. Not over money or status, but over the cold gaze from Antony that Margaret felt more deeply than any words. She longed to be loved, yet the only thing she received was distance, sometimes represented by the bitter sarcasm from the very man for whom she had sacrificed so much to marry. Then came a moment when every layer of self-respect could no longer shield anything further. The rumors in the newspapers were no longer groundless whispers once the evidence of Antony's secret relationships with other men gradually came into the open before the public. Margaret collapsed, no longer able to maintain composure. She threw herself into fleeting affairs as a form of retaliation to fill the bleeding emptiness in her heart. Yet the more she tried to cover it, the more she realized that emptiness could never disappear. The divorce in 1978 closed everything, not merely representing a shocking royal scandal, but also the full stop for a dream that had once been painted too perfectly. I spent my whole life searching for true love, only to realize I was merely one piece in his collection. And even though later Margaret chose to live more truly with her own nature, the scar that marriage left never truly healed. 10 stories. Yet, sharing one pain called the screen, Hollywood may glitter under the flashbulbs, but behind the red carpet and the perfect smiles stand hearts that silently endure deception. Why did they choose to stay? Perhaps that was the price of a cruel era in which difference was hidden away, and both sides became victims. The men fled from their true selves, while the women unwittingly became the protective shell, exchanging their entire youth and happiness after everything. Whether Angela Lansbury, Elsa Lanchester, or Amanda Blake, every story leaves behind one clear message. In love, the most cruel thing is not that affection has run dry, but that sincerity never appeared at all. Thank you for following. If you have thoughts, please leave a comment, and don't forget to hit subscribe so we can meet again in the next contents.